I know one of the things that is certainly relevant to you guys is you're in a category at Nissan which has been clearly majorly affected by the pandemic. Historically, consumers have spent a lot of time researching cars online, but still have preferred to purchase in store or go to the dealership and actually physically touch the car. And I've saw some stats that even as of end of last year, only millennials were a little bit more willing to purchase via e-commerce, but by and large, that was still very low as well. I gotta imagine there's a lot going on now to rethink that digitization of the shopping process. Tell us more about maybe what's going on as it relates to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the automotive industry and for Nissan, which was, right aligned with the trend, but our business completely changed overnight. So once you started to see dealerships that weren't able to close or that weren't able to stay open, we really had to shift into what is our strategy to be able to retail. And so what's basically happened over the last several weeks is that we and our dealers have been working very closely with our local governments on how can we actually start to have virtual retailing, which in automotive, that wasn't very prevalent and that type of trend wasn't prevalent. And what we've done on our end is actually start to accelerate e-commerce projects and shopping tools that were kind of several months, if not maybe a year down the road, and start to really accelerate those so we could begin implementation and launching those over the next kind of weeks to a couple of months. So we've really accelerated that cycle. I think, it's definitely driven by the need to be able to do this. I think, again, some dealerships, and it depends on the state, they are not considered to be essential business, but they have been able to work with their local governments on finding ways that they can actually retail virtually, which has been interesting. And it accelerated this trend of e-commerce in automotive.
Yeah, and I would guess that you're planning for this being a relative new normal, correct? That even once we're past the lockdown stage, if you will, is there an expectation that more of us will be more comfortable with shopping for cars online?
That's what we're seeing. I think what we want to do is first make sure that we have solutions depending on how consumers want to shop. And I think that's actually one of the biggest pivots that we've made. Instead of trying to force consumers into a shopping process that they may not be that comfortable with, now we want to be able to offer options for both. So if you're more comfortable doing online transaction or shopping, here are the tools for you. If you still want to go to a dealership, this is obviously once the businesses begin to open back up, here are the options for you. And so I think it's really starting to make it be dependent on what consumers want. Yeah. We do think, especially when you look at online retailing, I think this isn't a brand new trend, but more and more people are wanting to retail online. What we haven't necessarily seen quite yet at mass, though, is once you have those higher price, items such as cars, we haven't seen a ton of online retailing. I think there are a few reasons for that. Some of it is regulatory. I think the other thing is that there isn't necessarily infrastructure there, which at least on the Nissan side, that's what we've been really working to accelerate and working very closely with our dealer network in order to do that.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, and the consumer sentiment idea is another one that we talked about, and obviously has not only to do with shopping experience, but certainly how you market to consumers as well. How are you, given the changing nature of how we as consumers are dealing with the pandemic, and certainly I think adjusting again individually to our new normal. Listen, we've seen, as sure as you have seen, many brands, and I've seen you guys specifically have adjusted your messaging to kind of fit the times, but no doubt that's got to kind of evolve pretty quickly as well. How are you translating what we know about the consumer mindset just into your messaging to consumers overall?
Yeah, absolutely. When this all happened at the beginning of March, we were at the very beginning of launching the all-new Sentra, which was a new sedan that we were a next generation of our sedan coming into market. We had NCAA was one of our main marketing platforms to launch this vehicle, and again, in a matter of hours, that plan completely changed. So what we did is go back in and look at all of our marketing. We also had a sales event, and none of that seemed appropriate. I think, we didn't want to risk being tone deaf, and ultimately the demand and the consumer sentiment wasn't there for a heavy sales push on vehicles that they actually couldn't end up even purchasing, even if they wanted to. And so it was really going in and looking at what is the consumer sentiment? We spent a lot of time looking at what is the feedback happening online and social media channels. What are consumers looking for? What are the things that can help them feel confident? And then start to tailor our messages that way. And I think it's definitely a different approach versus what typically happens, which is, this is what we as the brand or marketer want to say. Now we're going to put it out there and let you adapt to it. It's definitely the other way around. And even now that we're a couple of months in, we're actually starting to tweak and adjust all of our existing communications over time based on the feedback that we're getting from consumers and what the consumer sentiment is. So again, at the beginning, we know that people are not going to want a heavy sales push. They're going to want something that is going to give them confidence in us as a brand, and that we're cognizant of what's going on, out in the world, especially with this pandemic. And then we're starting to evolve that over time. And what are the confidence factors that we can start to highlight? So whether it's something about service that we're able to provide, if it's about payment deferrals, if there are kind of economic concerns, those types of things. And then also I think a lot of marketers have taken an approach of, we understand, we're here for you. And consumers appreciate that. But now that we're kind of 2 months into that, now we need to evolve into this next phase of messaging, which we're working on now. And again, we're taking the input that we're hearing and seeing from consumers and adapting our messaging based on that.
Yeah, interesting. And how much of that gets more and more micro, which is to say, I think you highlighted key macro trends, but certainly one of the things that you and I have spent, last couple of years talking about on and off is how to get to that relevancy at a more micro segmentation level. Are you thinking more and more about how to do messaging using more audience intelligence that underpins that as well?
Yes, that's definitely, and that's been a part of our core marketing strategy for the past year. What we're looking at specific for COVID-19 is actually how can we get much more micro into what that messaging is based on what the market is. So there isn't a one size fits all when it comes to the markets, because some DMAs have different regulations than others. Some markets are having less, restrictions when it comes to the lockdown. And so we need to have much more tailored messaging depending on what the needs are in the different market. So for us, we have the audience segmentation tool, or we have the audience segmentation piece, which we're able to activate. But then it's also being able to provide a lot of, a range of messaging that we can use on a national level, but then also our regions and our dealers can use as well, depending on where they are in the consumer shopping process and where they are in the lockdown. So there may be some markets that need a more retail message, and there will be other markets that don't need a retail message at all, again, because the dealerships are closed. So then that becomes about service. What can they do? How can we stay kind of, in the mix in case there's something that's needed from Nissan from consumers?
Yeah, makes sense. So one last piece let's talk about, which is clearly connected here too, which is how you then put your media money in market, right? So you mentioned you were going to launch the Sentra, that obviously got delayed. I'm guessing that when it comes time to go through that launch process, the media strategy investment plan that you had at that time likely changes. And I'm sure that's not true just for this product launch, but in general. Maybe talk to how's the thinking at Nissan changed in terms of how you go about planning these big, large media investments that you guys make?
We've spent a lot of time over the last several weeks planning and replanning, especially when we get back to the central launch. I think the first thing is understanding that to bring a new product to market right in the middle of the pandemic, it's not going to be effective. So we paused that launch and we're deferring it to when the consumer demand returns. When we're looking at replanning that, we've spent a lot of time over the last several weeks looking at what are the ways that we can predict or project where consumer sentiment and where their media behavior is going to be. So we know that there's a lot more activity that's happening online. We know that that's where shopping is. Some of the big sports platforms that typically a lot of big brands align ourselves with, those aren't going to be there anymore. And so it's really going back and looking at where consumers, where do we think that they're going to be, and then trying to find the right type of platforms and partners that we can work with to get our messaging out there. We're looking at a few different scenarios, and we're looking at some that are more optimistic when it comes to, is there going to be a complete return back to normal? and then a little bit more of a pessimistic view, which is more of that, this is going to have long lasting impact in consumer behavior and sentiment, which is going to really impact what the, kind of what the media behavior is going to be. Chances are it's going to end up somewhere in the middle, but it's definitely going to need to be flexible depending on where you live in the country.
Yeah.
And so we're looking at those two things, adjusting our media plan, and then looking to what are the different partners that can help us launch this new product, and get that into market in a way that's relevant and where consumers are going to be.
So one last question. You mentioned the word flexible in there. If we think specifically about the TV or broadly defined TV market, inclusive of streaming video and streaming television, what's your view on the upfront? Maybe not just as much this year, which clearly is going to be very different, but also beyond. Where do you think that heads? And flexibility does seem to be part of the new normal. What's your thinking as it relates to that?
I think that this pandemic is something that will again cause a transformation in the upfront process. I think we've definitely already seen it in how we're approaching what our existing spend was for the quarter and how flexible that those dollars can be. And I think many of the publishers have been flexible with that. I think the upfront, it needs to go through its own transformation, one in how we can actually target and use video, whether it's TV or online video or streaming. How can we actually start to bring more audience segmentation tools into that process? But then you also need the flexibility of the dollars. When you have situations like this, it really pressure tests that system. And I think it's shown us as brands, as well as the whole upfront process and even to the networks, that we have to be able to evolve and we need that flexibility in place. And so I think that this will change what the upfront process is. I think that it was already starting to move in a more flexible direction and a much more advanced targeting standpoint. But I think it's really, what is the flexibility with your marketing dollars? I think that's where we'll see the next shift.